When I was younger, I believed the most dangerous things in life announced themselves loudly. But after more than 9 decades, I have learned that some of the things that can slowly change a life arrive almost silently. I did not feel a dramatic warning when my meals became saltier, my evenings became more restless, and my walks became shorter. Yet little by little, I began to notice that my body was asking me to pay attention. What frightened me most was not one frightening number on a monitor, but the thought that I might gradually lose the independence I had always taken for granted. I remember wondering whether one day my children would have to worry about me simply getting around my own kitchen. I also remember something else, something I wish I had understood much earlier. I did not need a miracle food, and I did not need to become a completely different person overnight. I needed to become more consistent with the ordinary things I already knew how to do. That realization came after years of doing almost the opposite. I was 58 when family troubles and a move to Riverbrook, Oregon, left me carrying a kind of tension I did not know how to put down. I ate whenever I remembered, which usually meant I ate too late. I bought prepared meals because they were convenient. I reached for salty foods because they were comforting. I told myself that I would rest after everything settled down, but life rarely waits politely for everything to settle. Eventually, high blood pressure became something I had to take seriously. My family doctor, Thomas Reed, never promised me a special food or a secret cure. I am grateful for that. He helped me understand that food could be part of caring for myself, but it was not a replacement for medical care. That distinction stayed with me. Middle, I began changing my meals slowly, and the first change seemed almost embarrassingly ordinary. I started eating oatmeal regularly, and I began to wonder whether the humble foods I had ignored for years might matter more than the expensive things people advertised. But oats were only the beginning, because the next food I discovered made me question one of my oldest ideas about healthy eating. I had spent years thinking that eating for my heart meant simply taking things away. I was about to learn that adding the right ordinary foods could be just as important, and one of those foods was sitting much closer to my pantry than I realized. I remember the first morning when I looked at my kitchen differently. I was not looking for a miracle anymore. I was looking for a breakfast I could repeat without feeling punished. I cooked plain oats, added a little ground flaxseed, and sat at the table instead of eating while standing beside the counter. That small act felt almost too simple to matter, yet it gave me a feeling I had not had for years: steadiness. I began paying attention to people around me, too, because I had always been curious about how older people managed ordinary life. Over the decades, I met people whose backgrounds were completely different from mine. And I noticed that the healthiest older people rarely seemed obsessed with one perfect ingredient. A woman I knew who had spent part of her childhood in Greece talked about simple meals, vegetables, beans, olive oil, and eating slowly. A Japanese acquaintance spoke about small portions and meals shared with family. An elderly neighbor in Riverbrook kept plain yogurt in her refrigerator and treated lentil soup as ordinary comfort food rather than as some special health program. I began to see a pattern. The people who remained active were often doing very unglamorous things again and again. They cooked more often. They walked. They ate vegetables. They used less processed food. They did not seem to believe that one bad meal had ruined their future. That last lesson helped me enormously. I had been thinking in extremes. If I ate too much salt one day, I felt I had failed. If I missed a walk, I felt I had lost momentum. My neighbor Evelyn Parker helped me see how foolish that was. She was skeptical when I started changing my meals. She teased me and said I had found another temporary diet that would disappear by the next month. I laughed because she knew me well enough to make the joke. Then something unexpected happened. Evelyn began noticing that I was cooking more often, walking more regularly, and sitting down to eat instead of rushing through meals. She did not suddenly become a believer. She simply became curious. One afternoon, she asked me what I was putting into my oatmeal, and I told her about ground flaxseed. Another day, she asked why I was buying plain yogurt instead of the sweetened kind. Middle. I realized then that the most convincing part of my changes was not what I said about them. It was that they had quietly become part of my life. Near the end, but there was still one question I could not answer. I had changed several foods, but why did my blood pressure seem so closely connected to the way I handled stress, meals, sleep, and even the atmosphere around my dinner table? That question led me to something I had ignored for most of my adult life. The more I watched my own habits, the more I understood that food was only one piece of the story. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at 74, checking my blood pressure after a difficult family conversation. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nobody had shouted. Yet I felt tense. My shoulders were tight, and the reading was higher than I expected. I sat there for a long time thinking about it. I had spent years believing that my body cared only about what I put into my mouth. Now I was beginning to understand that my body also responded to how I lived. I did not become a scientist from that realization, and I certainly do not consider myself one now. I simply became a careful observer of my own life. I noticed that the meals I ate when I was rushing felt different from meals I ate calmly. I noticed that I reached for salty packaged food more often when I was tired or upset. I noticed that skipping breakfast made me ravenous later, and being ravenous made me much less thoughtful about what I chose. So I kept the oatmeal, but I changed what surrounded it. Plain yogurt became a regular companion, sometimes with berries, sometimes with chopped fruit, sometimes with a little flaxseed. I liked yogurt because it was easy, gentle, and practical. I did not treat it as medicine. I treated it as one useful part of a balanced meal. Then came beans and lentils. I had eaten them throughout my life, but I had forgotten how useful simple food could be. I began making lentil soup, adding beans to vegetables, and keeping no salt-added canned beans available for days when I was tired. I learned to rinse canned beans when needed, and to let practicality beat perfection. The same thing happened with beets. For years I avoided them because they stained everything and reminded me of old-fashioned meals I thought I had outgrown. Then I began roasting them and adding them to salads. Middle, I had read that beets contain natural nitrates, and that researchers continue studying how foods containing nitrates may support blood vessel function. That interested me, but I never wanted to turn beetroot into a potion. I simply made it part of lunch. The fifth food became ground flaxseed. I liked that it was inexpensive and easy to stir into oatmeal or yogurt. Researchers have studied its fiber and plant compounds, and I found it comforting to have one more ordinary food I could use without changing my whole life. Still, I knew there was something missing. I could eat all five foods and still make the same old mistake if I continued eating heavily processed, salty meals. The next lesson was not about what I should add. It was about what I had never bothered to notice. I used to think salt was only the white crystals I sprinkled from a shaker, and that misunderstanding probably lasted far too long. I finally started reading labels, and I was shocked by how often sodium appeared in foods I had thought were harmless. Prepared soups, sauces, deli meats, crackers, packaged snacks, restaurant meals, and many convenience foods could quietly add much more salt to my day than I realized. I did not become frightened of every label. I became curious. That difference helped me. Fear made me want to change everything for 3 days. Curiosity helped me make changes that lasted for years. I began cooking more at home, and I discovered that herbs could make food satisfying without needing as much salt. Dill, parsley, basil, mint, garlic, lemon, and vinegar became regular visitors in my kitchen. Evelyn noticed this before anyone else did. One evening she came over while I was making beans with vegetables and herbs, and she looked at the pot as though I had betrayed my generation. She tasted it, paused, and said, "Where is the salt?" I laughed so hard that I nearly dropped the spoon. I told her that I had not removed flavor. I had simply stopped asking salt to do all the work. That became one of my favorite lessons. Healthy eating does not have to taste like punishment. Another mistake I had made was trying to change everything at once. I bought foods I had never cooked, made ambitious plans, and then became exhausted by my own enthusiasm. Eventually, I learned to make changes small enough that I could repeat them on an ordinary Tuesday when I was tired. Oatmeal could be breakfast. Lentils could become soup. Yogurt could be a simple snack. Beets could become part of lunch. Ground flaxseed could disappear into foods I already enjoyed. Nothing had to feel dramatic. I also became more careful about advice from other people. I heard claims that one food could transform blood pressure, and I learned to step back. My own doctor had never spoken that way. He reminded me that blood pressure can have many causes, and that individual needs differ. I continued monitoring my condition and following medical advice. I did not stop medication because I felt better, and I never wanted anyone watching me to think that food could replace professional care. That was another turning point for me. Near the end, I stopped asking, which food works fastest? And started asking, which habits can I still be doing 5 years from now? Near the end, I did not know then how important that question would become. I have now lived long enough to watch entire generations change the way they think about health, and one thing still surprises me. The people who remained active into very old age were rarely the people who followed the most complicated routines. I remember an older woman I met while traveling who walked to the market almost every morning because she liked choosing her own vegetables. I remember a gentleman who kept a small garden and said he stayed active because the tomatoes did not care how old he was. I remember friends who ate simple bean dishes, vegetables, fruit, yogurt, fish, and grains. But what stayed with me most was not any individual food. It was the rhythm. They had reasons to get up. They had people to call. They had places to walk. They prepared meals instead of surrendering every decision to convenience. That idea became especially important after I became friends with Evelyn. She began walking with me near the Riverbrook, first because she wanted to see whether I really walked as much as I claimed, and later because she admitted she enjoyed the walks. We talked about our children, our marriages, our regrets, and the ridiculous things that happen when two older women try to remember why they walked into a room. I noticed something during those walks. My mind became quieter. I was less likely to spend the evening worrying about yesterday. I slept more peacefully. I also began eating more slowly. I stopped treating meals as something I had to finish quickly. I put my phone away. I sat at a real table. Sometimes I used a cloth napkin even when nobody else was there. That may sound foolish, but it changed how I approached food. I was no longer rushing through a meal as though I were completing a chore. I was caring for myself. I believe that sense of calm helped me stay consistent, even though I would never claim that calm alone controls blood pressure. I also became more aware of movement. I did not suddenly begin exercising like a 20-year-old. I walked at a pace that felt appropriate for me, and on days when I was tired, I shortened the walk rather than abandoning the habit. That was another lesson from old age. Consistency matters more than performance. Some days I could walk farther. Some days I could not. I learned not to turn that into a moral judgment. The same was true of food. I still had birthday cake. I still enjoyed a restaurant meal. I still had days when my plans were imperfect. The difference was that one imperfect meal no longer became an excuse to abandon the entire pattern. Yet one question remained in my mind, and it was the question Evelyn eventually asked me one evening. "Margaret, What would you tell someone who feels they are already too old to change? Near the end, I had an answer, but I wanted to make sure it was an honest one. If I could sit beside my younger self today, I would not hand her a complicated diet. I would sit down with her and say, Margaret, start with tomorrow morning. I would tell her to make breakfast something simple and nourishing, perhaps the oatmeal that became so familiar to me, with ground flaxseed and plain yogurt or fruit if she enjoyed it. I would tell her to make beans or lentils part of ordinary meals, not because they were magic, but because they gave me fiber, plant protein, and useful minerals while helping me build meals around less processed food. I would tell her to give beets a fair chance, perhaps roasted with herbs and vinegar. I would tell her to keep plain yogurt available and to read the label instead of assuming that a food was healthy because the package said so. I would tell her to use ground flaxseed in a way that felt effortless. Most of all, I would tell her to look at the whole pattern. I would notice the salt hiding in prepared foods. I would cook at home more often when I could. I would drink enough water for my own needs. I would walk regularly if my body allowed it. I would eat slowly. I would create a peaceful place for meals. I would protect sleep. I would give myself permission to make small changes instead of demanding perfection. And I would keep my medical appointments. That last part is not a footnote in my story. It is part of my story. My doctor continued to monitor me, and I never treated my food choices as a substitute for treatment. If someone takes blood pressure medicine, I would never suggest stopping it because a food seemed helpful. If someone has kidney disease or another condition that affects how they handle minerals such as potassium, I would want that person to speak with a healthcare professional before making major dietary changes. I learned that even good foods are not automatically right in unlimited amounts for every person. That is why I speak about my experience rather than giving orders. Near the end, I also learned that change does not have to begin with fear. It can begin with care. I can still remember the old version of myself, sitting alone after a stressful day, reaching for salty convenience food, and telling myself that I would become healthier when life became easier. Life never became perfectly easy. I became better at caring for myself inside the imperfect life I had. That is what I want to leave with you. I did not become healthier because I found one secret. I became more attentive. I became more patient. I repeated small choices until they felt ordinary. But there is one final lesson I learned that mattered even more than the foods, and it took me decades to understand it. I am 97 years old now, and when I look back at the woman I was at 58, I feel tenderness more than regret. I wish I had known earlier that caring for my health was not an exam I had to pass perfectly. I wish I had understood that one difficult week did not erase a good month, and one restaurant meal did not erase years of better habits. I wish I had known that my body deserved patience rather than punishment. Most of all, I wish I had understood that hope is not the belief that nothing will ever go wrong. Hope is the belief that I can still choose something useful today, even when I cannot control everything tomorrow. My blood pressure journey taught me that lesson slowly. Oatmeal became a breakfast I could rely on. Beans and lentils became comforting staples. Plain yogurt became an easy part of my meals. Beets became something I genuinely enjoyed. Ground flaxseed became one of those quiet habits I barely thought about anymore. Reducing heavily processed salty foods became more natural as I learned to cook with herbs, vegetables, and simple ingredients. Walking beside the Riverbrook gave me movement and gave me somewhere peaceful to think. Sitting down to eat gave me a little dignity. Staying connected with Evelyn reminded me that health is not lived in isolation. And continuing to see my doctor reminded me that taking responsibility for my health also means knowing when I need professional guidance. None of those things promised me perfect health. None guaranteed a certain number on a blood pressure monitor. They simply helped me build a life that felt more balanced and more intentional. So when I hear someone say, I am already too old, I remember myself at 58. I remember how frightened I was. I remember thinking that perhaps the best years had already passed. I was wrong about that. There were still decades ahead in which I could learn, change, walk, cook, laugh, forgive, and sit beside the river. I cannot promise that the same choices will produce the same results for another person because every body and every medical history is different. But I can say this from my own long life. It is rarely too late to make one kinder choice. Maybe tomorrow begins with a bowl of oats. Maybe it begins with rinsing the salt from a packaged food. Maybe it begins with a short walk, a calmer dinner, a phone call to someone you love, or an appointment you have been postponing. I would not try to change everything at once. Middle, I would simply choose one small thing and repeat it. That is what I did, and repetition became my quiet form of hope. If my story gave you even a little of that hope, I am grateful you stayed with me. And if you would like to keep sitting here with me for more simple stories about healthy aging, nourishing food, gentle movement, and the ordinary habits that can make later life feel more hopeful, I would be very happy to have you here. Last, subscribe to the channel and let us keep learning together, one small habit at a time.